"Turn me over, this side is done." These haunting words are said to come from a man being executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. But were they a joke, a final act of courage, or a declaration of faith that echoed through history? This is the story of St. Lawrence, a man whose fiery death became one of the most unforgettable martyrdoms of early Christianity. The year was 258 AD. The Roman Empire was in chaos. Emperor Valerian had issued a sweeping edict. All Christian clergy were to be executed and their wealth confiscated by the state. Christians, considered enemies of Rome's gods and traditions, were now being hunted. Lawrence, known as the Archdeacon of Rome, was entrusted with the church's treasures and the care of the poor. When ordered by the Roman prefect to surrender all church wealth, Lawrence requested 3 days to gather it. What he did next would seal his fate and make him a symbol of sacred resistance. On the 3rd day, he returned not with gold or silver, but with the poor, the crippled, and the marginalized. He declared, "These are the treasures of the Church." This act was nothing short of revolutionary defiance. Furious, the Roman authorities sentenced him not to be beheaded, a relatively swift end, but to die by fire. He was bound to a gridiron of iron bars, placed over hot coals, and slowly roasted alive. Eyewitness records are scarce, but early church fathers, including Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century, confirm the method of execution. Ambrose notes that Lawrence conquered the flames by the strength of his faith. The irony and courage of his supposed last words, "Assum est, versa et manduca," "it is cooked, turn me over and eat," are preserved in church tradition, though scholars acknowledge they may carry symbolic meaning rather than strict historical certainty. What we do know is this: Lawrence's death was designed to be a spectacle of terror. Roasting a man alive was not a common punishment in Rome. This was reserved for criminals who needed to be made an example of. It was both punishment and propaganda, designed to instill fear in those who resisted imperial authority. But it failed. Instead, Lawrence's martyrdom ignited a wave of veneration. Within decades, his tomb in the catacombs of Syriaca became a pilgrimage site. Eventually, the Basilica of San Lorenzo fuori le mura was erected over his burial place, one of the 7 major churches of Rome today. The death of St. Lawrence reveals how the early Christian martyrs weaponized their suffering into a powerful narrative of spiritual triumph. The fire that was meant to consume him instead lit the torch of faith for generations to come. Flayed for faith, the skinning of Saint Bartholomew. What happens when suffering goes beyond the physical into the realm of faith, endurance, and legacy? For Bartholomew the Apostle, known in the Gospels as one of the 12 and in Eastern tradition as Nathaniel, the answer came not in sudden execution, but through one of antiquity's most excruciating tortures. He was skinned alive. Saint Bartholomew's final mission took him far from Roman Judea. According to early Christian sources, including Eusebius of Caesarea and accounts by later hagiographers, Bartholomew journeyed eastward, likely to Armenia, possibly passing through Mesopotamia and India, spreading Christianity in lands where Roman authority was thin, but paganism deeply entrenched. In Armenia, his preaching would ignite both conversions and fury. According to medieval Christian tradition, Bartholomew's preaching in Armenia drew the ire of a local king, identified in later sources as Astyages, the brother of a newly converted ruler named Polemius. Viewing Bartholomew's influence as a threat to traditional deities and political order, the king had him arrested, beaten, and ultimately condemned to death by flaying, the deliberate removal of skin from a living body, as described in hagiographical accounts. It is difficult to imagine a more brutal end. The process was slow. It was a prolonged and brutal ordeal intended not just to end a life, but to erase a legacy. Unlike crucifixion or burning, this was a punishment of exposure, both physical and symbolic. Bartholomew's skin, quite literally, was the price of his faith. According to the Synaxarion and the Golden Legend, two key collections of saintly lives, Saint Bartholomew was flayed alive, yet is remembered for praising God even in the face of such agony. Artists centuries later would immortalize this image. Bartholomew holding his own flayed skin, such as in Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel, where the saint's expression remains composed, triumphant even, as he bears the evidence of his suffering. His body, after the execution, was said to have been beheaded and thrown into the sea, later retrieved by Christian converts and entombed on the island of Lipari, before being moved to Benevento and eventually Rome, where the church of Saint Bartholomew all'Isola was built in his honor. Saint Bartholomew's death by flaying was more than an act of cruelty. It was intended to humiliate, to obliterate his identity. Yet, paradoxically, it became his eternal legacy. No matter how much flesh is taken, faith cannot be stripped away. Dragged to death for faith, the brutal death of St. Hippolytus. What happens when a man loyal to the empire becomes its victim? St. Hippolytus, once a Roman theologian aligned with imperial authority, suffered a death so severe it became one of the most brutal martyrdoms remembered in early Christian tradition. Hippolytus of Rome, known as one of the most significant early Christian theologians, lived during the turbulent 3rd century, a time when Christianity was still an underground faith, fractured by internal disagreements and persecuted by imperial law. Unlike many other early saints, Hippolytus was originally not a martyr, nor even wholly aligned with the Church. In fact, he was a rival of the Bishop of Rome, accused of schism, and known for his stern views on discipline and orthodoxy. But what transformed this learned man into a saint? In the year 235 AD, the Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax came to power, a military brute with a deep suspicion of the Christian faithful. Both Hippolytus and Pope Pontian, despite their differences, were arrested during a sweep of the Christian community. They were exiled to the mines of Sardinia, a place known not only for its inhumane labor, but also for its high death toll. It was there, in forced labor, that Hippolytus is believed to have reconciled with the Church, uniting with Pontian before they were both condemned to death. According to later Christian tradition and martyrologies, such as those preserved in the Acta Sanctorum, Hippolytus was sentenced to a particularly brutal form of execution. It is said that he was tied by his limbs to wild horses and dragged through rough terrain, a punishment meant to destroy the body and serve as a warning to others. While this specific method is not confirmed by contemporary sources, the story persisted as a symbolic account of a man once torn from the Church who was, in the end, physically torn apart by the empire he once served. His body was later recovered by Christians and buried with honor. His tomb became a place of veneration, and his name was inscribed into church liturgy. A century later, St. Jerome would list him among the great ecclesiastical writers, noting both his theological legacy and his tragic end. His most famous treatise, Refutation of All Heresies, remains a valuable source on early Christian doctrine and pagan philosophy. The martyrdom of St. Hippolytus reminds us that even those who once stood apart from the Church could become its saints. His death, whether symbolic or historical in its most vivid details, became a lasting emblem of unity, sacrifice, and the transformative power of faith under persecution. The tortured saint, St. George's trial by wheel. How does legend obscure reality and yet still reveal a deeper truth? St. George, known across continents as the dragon-slaying knight, was in fact a Roman soldier who became one of Christianity's most enduring martyrs. While his iconic image is wrapped in legend, Christian tradition tells of a man who suffered profoundly for his faith, possibly even enduring one of the most brutal tortures of his time. Historically, St. George is believed to have lived during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, around the late 3rd to early 4th century AD, a time when Christianity faced one of its most violent imperial crackdowns. George was not just a soldier, but also the son of a high-ranking Roman officer born in Cappadocia, modern-day Turkey. Raised as a Christian, he rose through the ranks of the Roman military, only to confront the empire he served. In 303 AD, Diocletian issued his first Great Persecution Edict, ordering all Christian soldiers to renounce their faith. George refused. Known as Georgios in Greek, he openly declared his Christianity before the court. For a Roman military officer, this was considered high treason. According to later Christian tradition and medieval hagiographies, especially the Passion of St. George, his torture began immediately. These accounts describe multiple phases of torment, including an ordeal involving a torture wheel. Unlike the breaking wheel used in later medieval executions, the Roman version was said to involve a rotating rack fitted with blades or spikes. Victims were bound and subjected to extreme physical trauma as the device turned. Tradition also holds that George was scourged, forced to drink poison, exposed to molten lead, and miraculously healed multiple times, before finally being beheaded in Nicomedia, likely around April 23, 303 AD. That date would later become his feast day, celebrated across Christendom. One account puts it poetically: his body was repeatedly broken, and still he praised the name of Christ. Whether literal or hyperbolic, such stories reflect a deeper truth about the man they commemorate: his unshakable faith in the face of extreme persecution. St. George's relics were eventually dispersed, and his cult spread rapidly, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire. He became the patron saint of soldiers and a symbol of spiritual valor, representing not just military virtue, but steadfast faith against overwhelming odds. She was mutilated for her faith, the martyrdom of Saint Agatha. What does it mean when even the right to speak is stripped away? For Saint Agatha of Sicily, the agony of martyrdom came not only through pain, but through the brutal silencing of her voice. According to later Christian tradition, her tongue was torn out, a punishment both symbolic and savage, inflicted to suppress the witness of faith in a time of relentless persecution. Agatha lived during the mid-3rd century in the city of Catania under Roman rule. She was born into a noble Christian family, known for her beauty, intellect, and unwavering commitment to chastity and the teachings of Christ. But when she rejected the advances of a Roman official, Quintianus, the governor of Sicily, her virtue became a death sentence. According to early Christian sources, including the Passio Sanctae Agathae, a hagiographical account dating to at least the 5th century, Quintianus was infuriated when Agatha refused to marry him or renounce her faith. In retaliation, he subjected her to a series of tortures, described in tradition as designed not only to cause physical destruction, but to break her spiritual will. She was first imprisoned in a brothel where she was beaten and humiliated. When she remained defiant, her torture escalated. She was subjected to brutal mutilation with iron instruments, an act so monstrous that even pagan observers reportedly recoiled. Still, Agatha did not recant. Then came the punishment that, according to legend, was meant to silence her testimony. Her tongue was forcibly removed, a mutilation intended to end her prayers, her protests, and her preaching. And yet, Christian tradition holds that even without her tongue, she continued to proclaim her faith through divine grace. In her cell, she was said to have been comforted by a vision of St. Peter, who miraculously healed her wounds, though, according to the same tradition, she would be tortured again. Finally, weakened and broken in body but not in spirit, Agatha succumbed to her injuries in 251 AD during the reign of Emperor Decius, known for his ruthless persecution of Christians. Agatha's martyrdom quickly became a rallying point for early Christian communities. Her tomb in Catania became a revered pilgrimage site, and miracles were soon attributed to her intercession. Most famously, the diversion of a lava flow from Mount Etna, which locals believed was stopped by invoking her name and carrying her veil toward the eruption. The mutilation of St. Agatha was a targeted act of cruelty, intended to silence a woman who dared to resist imperial power and male domination. But it failed. Her severed tongue became a symbol, not of silence, but of a voice that could not be extinguished. In agony, she found immortality, and in suffering, she bore witness louder than words ever could. Throughout history, martyrdom has exposed the furthest limits of cruelty and the unshakable strength of belief. The saints we've examined were not legends. They were human beings who endured the unendurable, revealing how power reacts when defied by conviction. Their suffering reshaped spiritual traditions and challenged empires. How do these brutal executions reflect the tensions between faith and authority in the ancient world? Comment below. As Tertullian once wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the Church."